So we are back with another EEO conversation, entrepreneurial ecosystem enabling organizations conversations. And we are today with Michele Zanini that just published Humanocracy together with Gary Hamel. And that in the last few years being straightly against bureaucracy, organizational bureaucracy, and the cost of bureaucracy. We are really honored to have Michele. Welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Hey, thank you, Emanuele. It's my pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you, thank you. So I think that in the last decades, we have seen a number of trends impacting organizations. The first one is really the disruption due to technological change. I think we have seen the internet, we have seen social media, now we are seeing artificial intelligence, putting many jobs at risk. On the other side, both in the US, where you are right now, and in Europe, we are seeing a mounting level of uncertainty, unpredictability, tensions, fragmentation, both at the market level, in terms of climate change, in terms of political unrest. All of these trends are impacting firms that see an ability of reacting to market shifts, to reinvent business models, to engage employees, to achieve enough productivity. How do you see these trends playing out, unfolding in your own work and in your own thinking?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, Emanuele. I mean, I wish we could take the whole hour just to talk about that. But, you know, it really is. I mean, you just hit on, I guess, a set of issues that really motivated Gary and me to write the book, right? Because, you know, we've been observing for many years that organizations from around the world are struggling with the same disabilities. They're just unable to deal with all the uncertainty, turbulence that you just talked about, right? Whatever the country, whatever the industry, it just seems that large organizations have a set of core incompetencies. You know, they're just they struggle with proactive change. You know, often deep change is crisis driven. It's very convulsive and it's very episodic. And it takes typically a change in CEO to set an organization a new direction after much ground and time has been lost, which is why, you know, a lot of the insurgents, you know, the new wave of companies, especially digital natives, often went out against the incumbents. I mean, think about Tesla and the rest of the auto industry. You know, the Toyota, BMW, Mercedes, whatever, they had, you know, so much resource advantages over Tesla, a complete startup. And yet they're, you know, a decade after, you know, seeing the shift towards electrical vehicles, they're still behind the curve, right? So organizations are unable to deal with proactive change. They're also unable to innovate in a sustained way. They're mostly, you know, incremental. They're not very good at changing business models, and they might have been able to be much more nimble when they were younger, but as they grow and become larger, they just get encumbered by the machinery of bureaucracy. And finally, you know, large organizations, we think squander a vast amount of human capacity. You know, just take the Gallup survey, which, you know, they survey around engagement, they survey thousands of people every year. And what it shows is that only 17% of employees around the world are fully engaged in their work, which means that 83% are not bringing their ingenuity, they're not bringing their initiative or passion to work every day, right? So when you see all this, you just realize that organizations are not able to deal with the challenges of the 21st century, and they need to change, you know, to change that very radically, not only for their own sake, but for the sake of society and the people working inside of them. So, you know, the challenge is how to become resilient, inventive, and, you know, and daring as the people that work inside of them. And that's why we wrote the book. And, you know, the premise of the book is that the bureaucracy is what makes it, you know, the traditional management model that operates most large organizations in the world is really what stands in the way. And so the book and our work is all focused on of dismantling that and replacing it with something that, you know, is fit for the times we live in.
Yeah, and there is one story that you, of course, cover into the book, and that's the story of the Hire. And the Hire, in a sense, is a bit of a unique organization, since they have been doing this proactive change for 40 years. And they end up experimenting with quite extreme practices. They have micro enterprises, so small teams of people working together with lots of autonomy and skin in the game. They have EMC for corporation, and they have platforms to support these organizations. Is there any one of these practices that really stand out for you? What is that surprise you the most about what Hire is doing in terms of practices, in terms of direction, in terms of being able to do what you were discussing as an obstacle for other large incumbents?
Yeah, well, Hire is a remarkable company. But before I get to a practice, let me just tell you a little story, that personal story from encountering Chairman Zhang about a decade ago. He had read Gary's book, The Future of Management, that had been published, I think in 2008, and he requested a meeting with Gary. I happened to be in California at the time, you know, working with Gary on a few things, so I ended up attending this meeting as well. And he basically said the following. He said, at Hire, we want to encourage our employees to become entrepreneurs, to become their own CEOs. Because people are not a means to an end, they're an end in themselves, right? And he said, our goal is to let everyone become their own CEO so that they can fully realize their potential, and then he went on and cited Immanuel Kant and a bunch of other philosophers, because that's how he thinks and talks, which is, you know, incredibly remarkable. But in a way, it's that kind of principle and paradigm that then informs all the higher practices which evolve over time, right? Because it's interesting to see Hire, and most people, when they look at Hire, they focus on, rightly so, because they're the most apparent things, you know, the practices of Hire, and they take the snapshot and say, wow, this is really remarkable. But, you know, what you see today is the product of the principles that really drive, you know, these kinds of practices, and then also the remarkable amount of management experimentation that Hire has been doing over the last 20 years, and so take something like, for instance, you know, the EMCs and these interactions between these micro enterprises. So I mean, it is pretty amazing how Hire is able to get coherence and coordination without the typical approach to generating that inside of a traditional company, which is hierarchy and top-down direction. Rather, you know, there are these interfaces between these micro enterprises that allow them to connect with one another, hold each other accountable, share in the benefits of their collaborative work, and so on. So probably for me, the most interesting feature of Hire is the disaggregated structure, you know, these micro enterprises, and how they're then able to interact with one another in a very productive way. Because in a way, it's like easy to disaggregate, right? But then the problem is, how do you disaggregate and then integrate in a way that doesn't require administrative, you know, control, right? So something like that, Hire has been experimenting with for at least 15 years. And it started with self-managing teams in the sales function, right? And then it said, okay, well, these are, you know, it's actually really interesting how these sales teams that are more empowered, you know, can be more productive and profitable. So let's extend that to more aspects of Hire and how it works. And then they tried to do that by creating contractual arrangements between, you know, market units and back office units, you know, finance, HR, R&D. And they found that to be, you know, very clunky and frictionful, because they hadn't quite figured out how the internal contracting could work. And then they iterated on that by creating these VAM agreements, which essentially specify more simply how different units work with each other, and more importantly, they created joint accountability for market results. So even if you're like in the R&D function or in the factory, you know, whether you get paid what you expect to be paid doesn't depend on like you delivering what you need to do, what you promised to deliver to the front end unit, but rather how well the product you contributed to does in the market. So they've tried a bunch of things, and they're, you know, evolving their model to learn from previous attempts. And so for me, like, so to answer your question in a very long-winded way, Emanuele, and I'm sorry it's taking me so long, I would say the disaggregated aspect is probably the thing that I like the most, and how it stitches things together. But I would like our viewers to take away from that is a result of a very different principle about organization and the role that human beings play, and the fact that it's a product of years and years of evolution, right? And as opposed to something that, you know, they just kind of thought of and implemented in, you know, in a few weeks.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And probably it's worth going one step back and spending a few moments to talk about what's behind the principles. You were referring to one critical principle. I would say one critical belief that CEO Gary Hamel has, and has been, let's say, infusing into those experiments, years of experiment. Is there any other belief or principle that you see behind the scenes into the practices that then higher adopted?
Yeah, well, I think there are several principles. I think there's, not to get too kind of fancy here, but I think there's a general paradigm and worldview which says, you know, human beings are enormously capable. And so we need to create organizations that unleash that capability. So, you know, what Hire and a lot of the companies in the post-bureaucratic vanguard do is they flip the typical kind of belief that it's not the human being that is the resource. The human beings are not the resources. The organization is the resource. It's the platform that human beings use, right, to better their lives and the lives of those they serve. So you gotta, in a way, to get higher in a lot of these other companies, you gotta start there. If you don't start there, if you think people are still the instruments, the tools, you're not gonna get, you can copy some of these practices, you're not gonna get very far, right? So there's that. And then beyond that worldview, I think, you know, we have highlighted 7 principles in the book, that Hire is a pretty good example of all of those. And if you want, I can kind of unpack those for our viewers in a few minutes.
Please.
Does that work, Emanuele? Okay, good. And maybe just to add some visual appeal, because people might be tired of looking at me. Let me just see if I can share a page here that has a little illustration of these principles. Let me just make this a little bigger. All right. Okay, cool. So the principle, let me just, before we get into each one of these. So our view is that to uninstall bureaucracy and build something better, you need to rebuild the management model of an organization around, you know, a new set of human-centric principles. And, you know, we think that 7 principles are key, and these are the ones we tee out in the book, and each principle gets its own chapter where we talk about what it means, why bureaucracy sucks at this, and then a few examples of companies that have really embraced it. So the first principle is ownership, right? So if given the chance, most of us would rather be owners than employees, right? And while not everyone can work in a startup, Hire and other organizations that we have in the book, Nucor, Handelsbanken, and so on, show that it's possible to build organizations where every team member has the autonomy and the financial upside that helps them feel and act like an entrepreneur. And I would emphasize autonomy and upside, not just autonomy, not just upside, right? They kind of have to go together, as they do at Hire, right? Where you have units that are self-directing, but also share in the gains, right, of their labor. So that's the first principle. The second principle is meritocracy. And, you know, it's a loaded term in this environment. A lot of people talk about the fact that meritocracy doesn't quite work, and we absolutely agree. The ideal is still important though, and bureaucracy in a way corrupts meritocracy. But I don't think, even though you might quibble with the term or don't think that it's really descriptive of societies and organizations, we all want to work in a place where we have the chance to develop our skills and be recognized for our contributions, right? And we need organizations where influence and compensation are correlated with competence and value added, right? And where politics and bias are minimized or kind of completely eliminated from processes. The third principle is markets, and here I think most of your viewers agree. A market economy is great because consumers have lots of choices, right? And markets are much better at aligning needs and resources more than centrally planned economies. But if you think about it, most businesses operate like a command economy, right? It's like the Soviet Union, where a small number of people at the top make most of the big decisions, and we think this needs to change, precisely because markets do better than planning, top-down planning. The fourth principle is community, and this is in a way my favorite principle. All of us crave genuine community, right? The ability to relate to other people in deep ways. It just gives you so much emotional strength and resilience, for when you know that you are accepted for who you are. And so in Southwest, by the way, Southwest Airlines is a great example. I think it's our main example around this principle, although not the only one. And their whole management model is focused on fostering deep trust-based relationships between people. And they know, they get it, right? When we feel safe and accepted, we do our best work. And our colleagues need to feel like family as opposed to coworkers. The fifth principle is openness. Communities are great and emotionally vital, but we also like to be in environments that encourage curiosity, learning, and candor. And that means being in an organization that is open to ideas wherever they come from. And again, Hire Here is a great example. The boundary of the firm is incredibly fluid and loose, right? So when you start a micro enterprise, you might get talent from outside, you might get capital from VCs, you might get technology from third parties, and the company acts as a platform where all those things come together, right? And it's pretty uncommon, but vitally important. The sixth principle is experimentation. There's something deeply satisfying about using your ingenuity to solve a new problem, to come up with a new idea and to test it. And experimentation is pretty fundamental to business success. It's the only way organizations can reinvent themselves. Yet in most companies, experimentation is very difficult to do. It's typically limited to the people that, few people that are supposedly have the credentials and the smarts to experiment. And therefore organizations don't evolve as fast as they ought to. And a lot of the organizations we talk about, experimentation is, constant and it's pervasive. And the last principle is paradox. You could also call this balance, but the companies like Hire and others that we profile in the book, Nucor, Bertsorg, and the like, have learned how to reconcile conflicting goals. They can walk and chew gum is an expression they use here in the US. They can do scale and agility. They can do innovation and efficiency. They can do freedom and discipline, right? And getting better at managing these tensions, getting better at paradox, means localizing key trade-offs, right? And giving frontline team members the information and skills they need to make smart real-time decisions as the situation demands. So that's, Emanuele, a quick summary of the principles. And the what we talk about in the book, and our big shtick, if you will, is that the way you dismantle bureaucracy is by taking each of these principles to heart and then embedding them into the way the organization works, like the management model of the organization. So let me see if I can pull up a slide that gives you this. Oh yeah, here we go. So the idea is take these principles and then think about how might you change a management process or an element of the management model, including structure, so that it's reflective of those principles, right? So let me just stop here. You might have some questions, thoughts, or comments, but that's
yeah, this is fascinating, and it's a very, of course, a very good description of the many aspects on which IR has been changing things. But my next question for you is this really unique? Or at the end, IR is doing well, and maybe on many aspects, at the same time, what the other organizations have been doing as well in their own way in the last few decades. And I know that in the book you mention other stories. So to what extent you believe that Burzorg or Nucor or Handelsbanken or others are really going in the same direction? So at the end, IR is just a representation of a bigger movement that somehow is unfolding into the business world.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one of the things we did in the research phase of the book was mine the long history of management innovation and progressive management practices. You know, that dates back to Alton Mayo and Chris Argyris, Kurt Lewin, you know, from the 1930s, even 40s and 50s, and see that in a way there's nothing new under the sun. Like, these ideas about putting people at the center of organizations and some of the practices that stem from that have been around for some time. And in a way, like, maybe if you read what people were saying in the 60s and the kinds of experiments the companies were running with the likes of Maslow or McGregor, Likert, and others, you know, they were more bold. I mean, they were just trying things. I mean, it makes agile look like small, because they were running entire plants with self-managing teams and starting them from scratch or changing them all together, and so, you know, this has been around for some time. The companies that we profile in the book, some of them may be new to readers, some may not, and we totally get that. And in a way, it's a kind of on purpose. You know, they do, and we'll get to this later. I mean, why, you know, they still remain relatively, you know, although things are changing, why they're still relatively a minority in terms of, you know, the business landscape, organizational landscape. But, you know, there are companies that have taken this path. I would say probably higher is the most radical, you know, in terms of the pace of change and the scope of the change. But, you know, there are others, as you mentioned. And, you know, let me maybe share another slide. You know, when you take all those principles that I talked about earlier, and you think about how they change the way an organization might operate, here's how we describe it in the book, like trying to have a bit of, do you see the slide, Emanuele? Tell me if it's not coming through.
Yeah, it is.
All right. So the bureaucracy on the left, we don't have to get to, but, you know, there are some common attributes, right? So all these companies, you know, they may have hierarchies and of influence. You know, not everybody's going to be capable in the same way, right, for every issue. But the fundamental difference is that the hierarchy that exists is a hierarchy of competence, not of position, and it's fluid, right? And if you're no longer adding value, you're no longer higher ranked than other people. You know, strategy is an open process, an evolving process. It's not done by the C-suite with some consultants, you know, in a offsite or whatever. It's something that everybody is involved in. Resource allocation is done in a, you know, with market mechanisms. Roles are fluid. You know, they're not rigid and narrow. They're broad, and they are compatible with the and in a way cater to the unique skills that people have. Teams are self-managing. The organization is disaggregated into small units responsible for the customer, whether it's internal or external, and all with a P&L, or at least significant economic kind of accountability for their results and the upside that shows for that. People are entrepreneurs. You know, control exists. Like these companies are not anarchies. They're incredibly disciplined and efficient, but you know, the control comes from peer-to-peer adjustments and horizontal coordination, not from someone from the top kind of creating the control, right? Which is, by the way, a real sticking point, because people often confuse, you know, the what from the how. You know, often the pushback you know, for people say, why? So you don't want like hierarchies anymore? How are you going to get, you know, people to coordinate with another? And the question is like, no, like you can still have a hierarchy, but you know, or you can still have control, but it doesn't have to come through the traditional bureaucratic ways. Like you can still have control through, you know, information, skills, joint incentives, and the like. So that's like a pet peeve of mine. And then, you know, compensation is correlated with impact. So a lot of these companies that we profile in the book, and there are many more that we don't talk about, really all exhibit these kinds of attributes. But, you know, we were very careful in the book, and some people may not agree with us, but we were very careful in the book not to say there is a complete model that you can copy, right? Which in a way is like holacracy. Holacracy is like, this is it, like this is what you need to implement. We're like, no, like you will end up with characteristics like the one I just walked you through, but you need to find your own path there, right? You will have commonalities, but you got to interpret the principles in a way that makes sense for you in your context, with your history, with your culture, right? So it's more of a kind of evolutionary path where you'll get to, you know, be more like hire than unlike hire, let's say, but you don't necessarily have to look exactly like hire.
I agree with everything you said. And on one side, it's energizing to see a bit more clarity about at least some directions, or at least some dimensions we should address as organizations if we want to progress and reduce bureaucracy and empower people and unlock their talent. On the other side, is a bit frustrating to see that most of the market is not there yet. Mm-hmm. So my next question for you, and this is something you were touching upon before, is why? What is missing? And what can we do, not just to transform a single organization, but to start a movement, and Gary talked about it quite a lot, to really help the market, the entire market, and potentially society, to see why working on these dimensions is important for human beings, and it's important for each one of us, and us together as a society and the species. What is missing? Because as you said, we have been talking about these trends with different names and some of these examples for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. It's good to have examples, but maybe it's not enough.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you have to recognize you're up against a formidable enemy, right? How do you kill something that, like bureaucracy, that is literally everywhere, right? And given how ubiquitous it is, you might be forgiven for assuming that it's like rooted in immutable laws. It's like the organizational equivalent of Kepler's law of planetary motion, right? That's just the way it is, right? Deal with it, suck it up. But we don't think that's the case. But that's certainly one obstacle. Is like people don't think there's an alternative, even though yes, they might have been exposed to a gore or whatever. They're like, yeah, but that's, you know, in a way the or higher. That's the exception that proves the rule. Second, you know, the second big obstacle is that the structure and rituals of bureaucracy, in a way, constitute a set of norms. And, you know, like all norms, you know, they're difficult to challenge. Like if you go into a company and say, well, let's just, you know, have the number of layers and just, you know, cut down the staff groups to, you know, a fifth of what they are right now, people will think you're crazy and you're like very naive, you know? Bureaucratic norms are particularly tricky because they're backed by a bit of a confederacy. You know, every organization is in a way embedded in a set of institutional relationships. So the consulting firms will tell you that, you know, the CEO, it needs to play a big role in charting the path of the company, which makes it then hard to, you know, accept the notion that, you know, strategy actually needs to be opened up, right? Government agencies may require, for regulatory reasons, a level of compliance, like in a big compliance department, compulsory training, and other things that make it difficult. And the last thing is business education. You know, business school promise students a fast track up the corporate ladder. You just give us your money and we'll turn you into a successful executive, right? So, you know, I think in the book we liken it to, you know, an American driving or European in the continent driving a car in the UK. Yeah, you can drive on the right side, you know, right hand side of the road if you like, but you know, it's probably not a good idea, right? So anyway, so that's the second barrier. The third barrier is that bureaucracies are complex integrated system. You know, they're almost like a nuclear power plant or, you know, a system of governance that characterizes a political system. So everything is connected to everything else. So where do you start? You know, where do you change first? And how do you change that without changing everything else? So, you know, doing the incremental tweaking might be easy, but it's not gonna be very impactful. And then changing the whole system as a whole is very daunting because you're like, holy shit, like how do I, you know, this is gonna blow up if I mess it up. So, you know, that's it. We gotta recognize that. And that's, by the way, where a lot of companies stumble. They just think, oh, let me just implement this thing from Spotify, you know, the squads, tribes, whatever, and then I'll get myself a natural organization. Well, you know, it's not so easy. And then, you know, maybe the last one, Emanuele, is that bureaucracies are massive multiplayer games where, you know, people compete for the scarce resource of and prize of promotion, right? And so like if you play that game and you acquire power and now you're told, well, you know, you gotta now change that and let other people lead, and you may not be so so happy about it. You know, it's like saying to LeBron James, who, you know, plays for the LA Lakers, saying, well, Mr. James, we recognize you're good at basketball, but we want you to play volleyball, right? Not gonna end well if you ask him to do that. So there are really big obstacles. Now, that shouldn't be cause for discouragement. I mean, but we got to be realistic, right? We have to say this is a big challenge. There are organizations that have evolved to these models, so there's hope that we can change. But let's not kid ourselves. There's a lot of work we need to do. And let me just maybe close by saying this, and then you can just react to it. I love your thoughts. But in the book, we kind of, our kind of recipe is you can boil it down to 4 M's. The first is motivation. You just need to be honest and transparent about the cost of bureaucracy for both for employees and for then human beings as a whole, right? So, sorry, for companies as a whole, for firms and the economy. We talk about the cost of bureaucratic drag. So the dollar amount that bureaucracy is costing us through lost productivity, lost innovation, and just people working on things that are not very value adding, right? And so you got to be able to quantify that and say, geez, this is just like we quantify the cost of climate change. We got to be able to tell ourselves, you know, the status quo in terms of how we manage ourselves is you know, there's a price tag associated with that. So there's the pragmatic aspect of motivation, and then there's the moral aspect, which is, you know, human beings deserve better, right? We just can't have fulfilled lives if we are, you know, working in environments that don't allow us to express ourselves fully. So that's one, motivation. The second is mindsets. You know, we just need to rid ourselves of outdated, you know, the managerialist beliefs that keep us trapped in the status quo. And in the book, we have a set of practices that we encourage people to take and embrace around detoxing your own bureaucratic beliefs. And, you know, because we realize change starts with us and, you know, with our own, you know, conceptions and our own behaviors. And then thinking about how do I, based on those beliefs that I've reset, how do I change my interactions with people that work in my unit within my perimeter? So how, and if you're a person with a position of power, how do you give power away? And by the way, if you do that, what you'll find is you're going to feel better about yourself too, and you're going to be more fulfilled. I mean, that's the experience of a lot of companies that have gone through this transition. We have a whole chapter on Michelin and how supervisors did that, and it was an eye-opening experience for them. So the second is mindset. The third is models. So a lot of the companies hire, and a lot of companies we talked about today and we talk about in the book, they do provide some examples, right? And inspiration that, you can do this. Although, as I mentioned before, you need to chart your way there. And the last one is migration. And so this is a really important one, which is you're not going to be able to rethink and re-engineer an organization through a top-down scripted model. It may work for an ERP implementation or something that is straightforward, but if you're trying to break new ground, if you're trying to do something really different, and if you want to re-engineer a system that is very complex, you just can't do it, through a formulaic top-down kind of approach, right? You need to instead have a syndicate that work of changing the organization to everyone, make that an experimental process where you're generating new thinking, but you're also evolving that thinking and verifying it through experiments. It's crazy to me that the whole notion of business model innovation makes sense to a lot of people, but so the notion of experimenting and prototyping with business models is now broadly accepted. But when it comes to management practices and management processes and management models, we just don't have the same thinking, but we should, right? So there's no reason why we can't evolve the way we do people practices or budgeting or whatever in a similar kind of experimental way, and then test it. But for that to happen, you just need to rethink your approach to change. So that's the fourth M, migration. And so in a way, you got to be able to operate at all those levels to have a hope of changing, and dismantling bureaucracy, both like in your own mind, in your own organization, and then more broadly across society.
I see two themes that we have somewhat talked about that are central to this journey. And the first one is a new concept of leadership, a new role for leadership. And to me, this is a double-edged sword because in many of the stories, we can see CEOs or owners such as Jan Grimin or Chris Raffer that have studied this, but often have also nudged it for years or decades. So you need an enlightened leader, and also one that will stay for as long as is needed. And then when the leader is going away, you don't know what is going to happen. Everything may be reverted. The second precondition, let's say, I see is that even the idea of changing the organization. So what most consulting companies are selling and what most clients are expecting from consulting companies should look in a radically different way. Meaning that you don't know the exact outcomes, you don't have a 3 years Gantt or specific activities and deliverables. At the end, it's largely emergent. And that's scary. It's scary. So for the leadership, it's scary for the people that somehow like to be comforted and guaranteed about the result. So it's not just changing the firm, it's changing some of the basic constructs and tools that the firm is have been using at least for decades. Yeah. Do you have the same feeling?
Yeah, it's true. Let me start with the change piece first, because I completely agree with you. Like, the change management is like saying jumbo shrimp or man bun. It's like an oxymoron, right? Maybe it works, as I said, if you're trying to change something that is fairly predictable and straightforward, but systemic change can't be designed and deployed top down. But I would tell you this, it's actually, it should be far less scary than a CEO might think. In fact, the CEO should, find it incredibly compelling that you can initiate the change process and then let the organization, by inviting people to participate, but then let the organization work through it and generate much better ideas. I mean, we've done this kind of work in companies where literally the only thing the CEO has done. And so the CEO typically would bring us in because he or she sees that there's a problem, like we need to be more innovative or whatever. And then, and would also say, and I don't know the answer to this. Like you guys have to figure it out, and would write a blog about it. Right. And then that's it. That's what the CEO, and then the CEO kind of steps away, and then the system takes over. And if you do it with enough structure and organization, so it doesn't devolve into, some chaotic initiative, which is pretty easy to do, just to keep it on the rails, then it's amazing how easy it is to get this started and how safe it is, right? And how effective it is. So, like, I think a CEO might think that he or she has more control by saying, here's what we're going to do. But in fact, the control is probably less, because as soon as the CEO sets that direction, people are going to find all sorts of ways to evade it, ignore it, right? And it might be easier or quicker for the CEO to say, this is the direction we'll take. But then you shouldn't measure time to answer, you should measure time to impact. So it might be easy for a CEO to say, with his own little circle, to say, this is what we're going to do. So time to answer, but then you got to spend like a year convincing everyone else to do what you want them to do. If you instead invest a little bit more up front, getting a broad conversation around the future and how we get there, it's probably going to take a little longer than doing it on your own, but time to impact is far shorter. So I hope that CEOs and other enlightened leaders get it, that, it shouldn't be a scary, what you should be scared of is continuing on your traditional ways of changing, which, evidence suggests typically fails. So like, how's that safe, right? So that's on change. Then the other thing, Emanuele, and maybe you want to react to that, but I want to get back to your leadership point.
Please go ahead on leadership. I think they're connected.
All right. No, the only thing I would say on leadership is absolutely right. The folks that are on top of these, and on top is like metaphorically, they're not really, kind of driving the organization as a command and control autocrat, but what they see themselves as playing the role of a social architect. Like, they create the conditions for other people to emerge as leaders, right? Which is very different way of thinking about leadership, and not corrupted by the bureaucratic kind of a model. And it's very much what Mary Parker Follett, who is one of my favorite management thinkers, she was active in the early part of the 20th century. She said, the role of leaders is to create other leaders. And that's what all these CEOs and others do, right? And so that definitely requires us to change and challenge the idea of leadership that predominates in most organizations, right? The competence in leadership isn't, administration. That's in a way like a commodity. It might have been like something, a scarce skill in the 50s or the 60s, but now, like, we've kind of figured out how to run a large, complex organization, how to, keep things humming. So the competence in leadership tasks that really matter, like spotting opportunities, energizing colleagues, nurturing others, doesn't correlate with hierarchy. But like, if you go to a business school, it doesn't receive a lot of attention, right? So we definitely think that we got to rethink leadership and leadership development, and it's only when we will abandon the myth of that a big title makes you a leader, and when the HR function stops playing to the top of the house, then we'll hopefully be getting somewhere, and that will require a very different kind of approach to business education, which instead is still focused on these old tenets.
Yeah, that was another area I was thinking about, but it's a big one. Probably there are a number of social structures that come before companies, it's just education, um, but that have so much impact on what we see in
Yeah.
companies. So, as you said at the beginning, it's really a complex system. So the whole is made of interconnected, interdependent parts, and it's not possible to untangle them. We have to play, we have to dance with the system,
Yeah.
not to fix the pieces.
Yeah. You have to, and it's going to be a long haul, but a long road ahead. But I think you have to basically, you have to really play at all those levels. I think progress, these higher and others show that progress is possible, and not only is it possible, it's profitable, right? Individually and economically. So I have no doubt we'll get there, but we just need to commit ourselves to a serious and long journey that changes all these different aspects. And so yeah, um, but there's it's definitely, I think it's just a matter of time, and the challenge for all of us then is, how do we accelerate that? What is our role in accelerating that in our organization and then more broadly?
I would like to ask you a final question regarding time. Do you have this feeling that we're actually approaching or maybe living already into an inflection point at the societal level? Um, because organizations, have a responsibility, but not just about the business, but about humanity. Because many of these large incumbents at the end give work to, millions of people, but
Yeah.
that have impact on hundreds of millions or billions of people. And the way in which we inhabit our planet, the way in which we extract value from its resources, the way in which we squeeze energy out from people, from human beings, must change. Do you think that we are near this point, or at the end business can just go on as usual for another decade or 50 years?
Yeah. Oh boy, I wish I could give you a confident answer, Emanuele. I think there's definitely a window of opportunity for us, and maybe COVID in a paradoxical way is accelerating this. People, maybe are more prepared for a reset. So we definitely have the opportunity, and we should do everything we can to take it. But I don't think it's going to happen on its own. I think we'll need to push to make it happen, because I could see a scenario where nothing happens. Like maybe something happens at the fringes, but fundamentally the model isn't that different. And again, I think it's quite instructive to go back to the 50s and the 60s, and people were saying, you had Warren Bennis, who's a very distinguished, he's no longer with us, but a very distinguished management leadership thinker, who was like in the 60s saying, oh, bureaucracy is a thing of the past. In like a few, in like 25 years, it's going to be gone, and because society is technologically advanced and people are skilled, and will evolve into complex adaptive organizations. And Alvin Toffler wrote Future Shock in 1970. He talked about adhocracy. Drucker talked about in the 80s about how, because of technology and the fact that we can now coordinate with each other in much direct way horizontally, we don't need as many managers. And so he said we'll have, I don't know, it was like half the layers and a third of the managers, or a third of the managers, half of the layers, but something like that. And it hasn't happened. So we got to be, we have to be, we can't just be rest on our laurels and say, oh, here we are, the new era is upon us. In a way, we have we have headwinds. No, sorry, tailwinds. We have tailwinds. Well, we have headwinds too, but I think we have things that are propelling us towards a new era, but it's not a given. But I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful. And there are things that are available to us today in terms of organizing and the technology. You talked earlier about technology, but the ability for us to interact with one another in very different ways through just allow new forms of organization. And so that should certainly make a big difference now compared to even a few decades ago.
And I really thank you for your time, because I think that we are fighting the same battle and we have to fight it together.
Yeah.
This is the feeling I have at the end, connecting the dots. It's one of the goals of these interviews, because we see so much resonance and so much energy in different places, in different teams, and different individuals. And probably we should find ways to come together instead of fighting around small battle in our own country or company, to reach this critical mass that is so important at the end to make a dent in the universe. So thank you so much for your insights and for your book. I really personally appreciated it. We are going to keep talking about these topics in our masterclass that is coming up in 1 month. It will be about the random AI, again, hair, but not only about hair. And Michele, thank you again. I would like to stay in touch with you and with your work. Thank you for all the effort that you are putting in fighting bureaucracy and in helping organizations to, I wouldn't say jump, but to at least walk to the next level.
All right. Well, I appreciate the time, and the feeling is mutual, Emanuele, and I look forward to joining forces with you and whoever's listening going forward and making this happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right.
Bye.